Near Turkey's eastern frontier, just a short distance from the border with Iran, lies one of archaeology's most debated locations. Resting on the southern slopes of the extinct Mount Ararat volcano, at an altitude of around 6,500 feet, is a massive landform that has fueled controversy for more than 6 decades. Its appearance is extraordinary. The formation resembles a giant ancient ship, featuring a pointed front, a rounded rear, and raised outer edges that create the outline of a large vessel. Stretching roughly 538 feet in length, it sits high in the mountains, far from any modern sea or lake that could naturally explain the presence of something with such a distinctive shape. The site first came to public attention in 1948 when Turkish Army officer İlhan Durupinar photographed it during an aerial survey. More than a decade later, in 1959, those images attracted worldwide attention after being featured in Life magazine, sparking speculation that the unusual formation might have archaeological significance. Most geologists have long argued that the structure is entirely natural. According to the prevailing explanation, it was created by ancient mudflows that gradually hardened while erosion carved the surrounding landscape into a shape that only appears ship-like. Today, the Turkish government officially recognizes the location as the Durupinar site, named after the officer who first documented it rather than identifying it as Noah's Ark. For many years, that scientific explanation remained largely unchallenged. However, recent investigations have reopened the discussion. An international research team, led by American investigators and working under permits issued by Turkish authorities, has returned to the site using technology that simply wasn't available decades ago. Instead of relying only on surface observations, the researchers have employed ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity imaging, and detailed soil analysis to study what may lie beneath the formation. Their published observations have raised new questions. Survey data suggests the presence of large internal cavities and elongated rectangular spaces located around 4 meters below the surface. Some of these features appear to extend for hundreds of feet while following the same direction as the overall structure, with estimated heights of roughly 2 meters. Laboratory analysis has also revealed that soil collected from inside the formation contains significantly higher levels of organic material than samples taken immediately outside its boundaries. Researchers further noted that the site's dimensions closely resemble the measurements described in the biblical book of Genesis, when converted using the ancient cubit system, a similarity they consider statistically noteworthy. Although none of these findings conclusively prove the site is an ancient vessel, they have prompted fresh scientific interest because no universally accepted geological explanation has yet accounted for every observation reported by the research team. As a result, the Durupinar Formation has once again become the focus of international study. Rather than attempting to confirm or dismiss long-held beliefs, current investigators say their goal is simply to determine what truly exists beneath the surface through careful scientific examination. To understand why this mountain site continues to attract worldwide attention, it is important to look beyond the physical evidence and examine the ancient traditions that inspired generations of explorers to search this region. The story of a world-destroying flood is not exclusive to the Bible. Similar accounts appear throughout the civilizations of the ancient Near East. One of the oldest examples is found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian text written centuries before the Hebrew Bible reached its final form. Despite originating from different cultures, both narratives describe a devastating flood, a specially built vessel, and a small group of survivors preserving life through the catastrophe, leading many historians to compare the remarkable similarities between these ancient traditions. Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian flood hero, is warned by the god Ea that the divine council has decreed humanity's destruction. He builds a boat. He loads it with his family and with animals. The flood comes. The waters recede. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. The parallels are not coincidental. Scholars have debated for over a century whether the Hebrew flood narrative was derived from the Mesopotamian tradition, whether both traditions preserve independent memories of a common event, or whether the structural similarities reflect narrative conventions that spread across the ancient Near East through cultural transmission. The debates are unresolved. What is clear is that multiple ancient civilizations preserved accounts of a catastrophic flood and a vessel that survived it, and that these traditions, taken collectively, represent one of the most widespread mythological structures in human cultural history. The Genesis account is the most detailed. The Book of Genesis, chapter 6 through 9, describes the construction of the ark in specific terms. The vessel is to be 300 cubits in length, 50 cubits in breadth, and 30 cubits in height. It is to be made of gopher wood, and it is to be sealed with pitch. It is to contain multiple levels, a door in its side, and a window near its roof. The dimensions are significant. A cubit is the distance from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, a unit of measurement used throughout the ancient Near East, with some variation between cultures. The Egyptian royal cubit was approximately 52.5 centimeters. The Hebrew cubit was similar, possibly slightly shorter. 300 cubits, using the Egyptian royal cubit, equals approximately 157 meter, or roughly 515 to 538 ft, depending on which cubit standard is applied. The Durupinar Formation measures approximately 538 ft in length. This dimensional correspondence first drew attention to the site and continues to fuel interest in it, despite 6 decades of mainstream dismissal. The Genesis text specifies that the ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. The Hebrew construction is plural. Mountains, not mountain. The text does not specify a single peak. It specifies a region. The region of Ararat corresponds to the ancient kingdom of Urartu, which occupied the highlands of eastern Anatolia and the Armenian Plateau during the 1st millennium BC. The modern Mount Ararat, Agridegi in Turkish, is the highest peak in this region, rising to over 16,000 altitude. But Mount Ararat is not the only mountain in the region of Ararat. Mount Tenderek, where the Durupinar site is located, is an adjacent volcanic peak, approximately 60 meters southeast of Mount Ararat proper. It sits within the same highland region. It is, by the geographic standards of the Genesis text, within the mountains of Ararat. The Quranic tradition adds another layer. The Quran in Surah Hud 1144 specifies that the ark came to rest on Mount Judi, a different location than the biblical Ararat. The precise identification of Mount Judi has been debated by Islamic scholars for centuries, with various candidates proposed in the regions of southeastern Turkey and northern Iraq. Some scholars have associated Mount Judi with peaks in the Mount Tenderek region. The textual traditions do not point to a single unambiguous location. They point to a region, a highland zone in eastern Anatolia, where multiple peaks could plausibly match the ancient descriptions. The Durupinar site sits within that region, and it is shaped like a boat. The formation was first photographed in 1948 or 1949. İlhan Durupinar was a Turkish army captain participating in a NATO mapping survey of eastern Turkey. The survey used aerial photography to create detailed topographic maps of the region. Standard Cold War-era reconnaissance work that covered terrain near the Soviet border. In one of the photographs, Durupinar noticed an unusual feature on the slopes of Mount Tenderek, a boat-shaped outline. The photograph sat in military archives for approximately a decade. In 1959, the photograph came to the attention of researchers who recognized its potential significance. In September 1960, Life magazine published the image, bringing the formation to international attention for the first time. The photograph was striking. The formation appeared almost too perfect. A symmetrical, elongated shape with raised walls and a pointed prow, sitting in isolation on a mountainside where no boat had any natural reason to be. The publication generated immediate interest. Expeditions were organized. Researchers traveled to the site. The Turkish government began coordinating access. The initial on-ground investigations were disappointing. Researchers who visited the site in the early 1960s found what appeared to be a natural geological formation. The walls were composed of the same material as the surrounding terrain. There was no visible wood, no visible construction, no obvious evidence of human manufacture. The mainstream conclusion was swift. The formation was natural, probably a doubly plunging syncline, a geological structure created when layers of rock fold and erode in ways that can produce boat-shaped outlines. The symmetry was unusual, but not impossible. The dimensions were coincidental. The site was not Noah's Ark. It was a curiosity, a geological accident that happened to resemble a boat. For most of the scientific community, the case was closed, but for a subset of researchers, the case remained open. Ron Wyatt was the figure who brought the Durupinar site back to public attention. Wyatt was an American nurse anesthetist who became in the 1970s and the 1980s one of the most controversial figures in biblical archaeology. He claimed to have discovered not only Noah's Ark at the Durupinar site, but also the crossing point of the Red Sea, the true Mount Sinai, and the Ark of the Covenant. Mainstream archaeology rejected these claims. His methods were criticized as unscientific. His evidence was dismissed as fabricated or misinterpreted, and his conclusions were considered driven by religious conviction rather than empirical investigation. Wyatt died in 1999. His legacy remains contested. What cannot be denied is that Wyatt's expeditions to the Durupinar site in the 1980s generated renewed interest in the formation, and that some of the techniques he pioneered, including the use of metal detectors and subsurface probing, produced results that subsequent researchers have sought to verify or refute. Wyatt said he detected metal readings within the formation that suggested the presence of iron fittings, such as nails, brackets, or other hardware consistent with ancient ship construction. He also reported what he interpreted as deck structures beneath the surface. He reported finding anchor stones in the surrounding area. Those claims established a research agenda that later investigators would revisit with more sophisticated technology. David Fasold and John Baumgartner represented a more credentialed approach. Fasold was a marine salvage expert with extensive experience in locating and documenting shipwrecks. Baumgartner was a geophysicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, one of the most prestigious research institutions in the United States, with expertise in computational modeling and subsurface imaging. In the 1980s and 1990s, Fasold and Baumgartner conducted investigations at the Durupinar site using ground-penetrating radar and other geophysical methods. Their initial findings were intriguing. The GPR data appeared to show linear features beneath the surface, structures that Fasold and Baumgartner initially interpreted as possible deck timbers or internal partitions. The dimensions continued to match the biblical specifications. The formation's orientation, its elevation, its position relative to the surrounding terrain, all of these factors seemed, to Fasold and Baumgartner, to support the possibility that something other than natural geology was responsible for the site. They published their findings. They presented at conferences. They brought scientific credentials to a site that had been dismissed as a curiosity. And then they changed their minds. Both Fasold and Baumgartner ultimately concluded that the Durupinar Formation was probably natural. The linear features in the GPR data could be explained by geological processes. The dimensional match with the biblical cubit, while striking, was not sufficient evidence to override the absence of physical artifacts. The formation's composition, the same mudstone and volcanic material as the surrounding terrain, argued against human construction. Fasold died in 1998, having publicly revised his position. Baumgartner continued his research but acknowledged that the evidence was ambiguous. The mainstream consensus held. The Durupinar site was a natural formation. The case was closed, or so it seemed. Lawrence G. Collins provided the definitive critique. Collins was a retired professor of geology at California State University, Northridge, with expertise in igneous and metamorphic petrology. He visited the Durupinar site and published peer-reviewed analyses of its geological structure. His conclusion was unambiguous. The formation was a doubly plunging syncline, a fold structure created when layers of sedimentary rock are compressed and then eroded. The boat shape was the product of differential erosion acting on layers of varying hardness. The symmetry was unusual, but not unprecedented. There was no evidence of wood. There was no evidence of construction. There was no evidence that the formation was anything other than a natural geological feature that happened to resemble a boat. Collins' analysis was accepted by the mainstream geological community. The Durupinar site was classified as a natural formation. The Turkish government maintained it as a tourist site. Visitors could see the boat-shaped formation and draw their own conclusions, but the official scientific position was clear. Not Noah's Ark, not a ship of any kind, a geological curiosity. The case was closed, and then the new scans began. Andrew Jones is the researcher at the center of the current investigation. Jones leads a project variously referred to as Noah's Ark Scans, or the Doomsday Mountain Project, working under archaeological permits issued by the Turkish government and in collaboration with Turkish universities, including Aksaray University and Istanbul Technical University. The project has been conducting systematic geophysical surveys at the Durupinar site since around 2019, using technology that has advanced significantly since the Feisold and Baumgartner investigations of the 1980s and the 1990s. Ground-penetrating radar or GPR systems have improved dramatically. Modern GPR units can achieve resolution and depth penetration that earlier systems could not match. The data processing algorithms that convert radar returns into subsurface images have become more sophisticated. The ability to distinguish between natural geological features and anomalous structures has improved. Electrical resistivity tomography, known as ERT, provides a complementary imaging method. ERT measures how electrical current flows through the ground, identifying variations in subsurface conductivity that can indicate different materials, voids, or structures. The technique is widely used in archaeology to locate buried walls, chambers, and other features. The Jones team has applied both methods to the Durupinar site. The results have been publicly reported in media appearances, conference presentations, and preliminary publications. What they claim to have found is significant. The ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity tomography data show internal voids within the formation. The voids are not random. They are rectangular. They are aligned with the long axis of the formation. They extend for hundreds of feet at depths of approximately 4 man-hours below the surface. Their vertical dimensions are approximately 2 man-hours, consistent with the internal deck spacing that would be expected in a large wooden vessel. The mainstream geological explanation that the formation is a solid mudflow or syncline structure does not easily account for rectangular voids. Natural geological processes can create cavities, but they do not typically create rectangular cavities aligned in parallel rows. The void structures are anomalous. The soil chemistry findings are also anomalous. The research team has conducted systematic soil sampling inside and outside the formation's boundaries. The samples have been analyzed for organic content, the presence of carbon-based material that would indicate biological matter. The soil inside the formation contains approximately 3 times more organic material than the soil immediately outside it. This finding is difficult to explain under the natural formation hypothesis. If the formation is simply a mud flow or syncline composed of the same material as the surrounding terrain, the organic content should be similar throughout. The elevated organic content inside the formation suggests that something different is present, something that has contributed carbon-based material to the soil in concentrations that the surrounding terrain does not share. Wood decomposes. Over thousands of years, wooden structures buried in soil break down into organic compounds that become incorporated into the surrounding matrix. A large wooden vessel buried and decomposed would leave behind elevated organic content in the soil that once surrounded it. The soil chemistry is consistent with that scenario. It is not proof, but it is consistent. The dimensional analysis has been refined. The formation's length, approximately 538 ft, has been measured with modern surveying equipment. The correspondence with 300 cubits, using the ancient Near Eastern cubit standards, has been calculated with greater precision than earlier estimates. The match is close, not perfect. Measurements of natural terrain features are never exact, but they are within the range that the research team considers statistically significant. The width-to-length ratio has also been examined. The formation's width-to-length ratio approximates a 50-to-300 ratio, specified in Genesis. A 1-to-6 proportion that naval architects have noted is consistent with the structural requirements of a large seagoing vessel. The proportions are anomalous for a natural geological formation. They are consistent with intentional design. The research team has been careful about their claims. Jones and his collaborators have not declared that the Durupinar Formation is definitively Noah's Ark. They have stated that their findings are preliminary, that further investigation is required, and that the evidence needs to be subjected to peer review and replication. They have acknowledged the mainstream geological position. They have acknowledged the history of the site and the previous investigations that concluded it was natural. They have stated that their role is to gather data, to apply modern technology to a question that earlier generations could not fully answer, and to let the evidence speak for itself. The evidence, as they have reported it, is anomalous. The voids are anomalous. The soil chemistry is anomalous. The dimensions are anomalous. The mainstream geological explanation does not easily account for all of these findings. The mainstream response has been cautious. The findings have not been published in top-tier peer-reviewed journals. The data has been presented in media appearances and conference settings, but the formal academic vetting process has not been completed. This matters. Peer review is the mechanism by which scientific claims are evaluated by independent experts. Until the Jones team has subjected their findings to that process, until other geologists and archaeologists have examined the raw data, visited the site, and attempted to replicate the measurements, the findings remain preliminary. The history of the Durupinar site includes multiple instances where initial enthusiasm was followed by revised conclusions. Fasold and Baumgartner initially supported the site's significance and later revised their positions. Wyatt's claims were never validated by mainstream science. The pattern suggests caution, but the pattern does not invalidate the current findings. The technology being used today is superior to what was available in the 1980s and the 1990s. The methods are more rigorous. The data is more detailed. If the voids are real, if the soil chemistry differences are real, if the dimensional correspondences are real, then the mainstream geological explanation will need to account for them. And so far, it has not. The Ararat anomaly represents a separate but related mystery. On Mount Ararat itself, the higher peak that most people associate with the biblical account, U.S. military reconnaissance aircraft photographed what appears to be an anomalous object embedded in glacial ice near the summit. The photographs date to the 1940s and the 1950s, taken during Cold War-era surveillance of the Turkish-Soviet border region. They show a dark, elongated shape protruding from the ice at elevations above 15,000 Dewaster. The photographs were classified for decades. They were released through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1990s and the 2000s. The CIA files describe the object as the Ararat anomaly, without concluding what it is. Expeditions have attempted to reach the location. The terrain is extremely difficult, high altitude, glacial ice, and severe weather. Most expeditions have failed to reach the site. In 2010, a Hong Kong-based organization called Noah's Ark Ministries International claimed to have entered a wooden structure inside Mount Ararat's ice, and to have recovered samples dating to approximately 4,800 years ago. From the beginning, not everyone accepted the discoveries without question. Researchers and critics quickly challenged many of the claims, pointing to concerns about how the evidence had been gathered and documented. Several of the collected samples were never independently verified, while the methods used during earlier expeditions became the subject of ongoing debate. Another source of confusion has been the so-called Ararat anomaly. Unlike the Durupinar Formation, this is a completely separate location situated roughly 60 miles away at a much higher elevation. Over the years, theories about the anomaly have ranged from an unusual rock formation to the remains of an aircraft, while others believe it could represent something entirely different. Because the two sites are frequently mixed together in public discussions, the evidence surrounding each has often been misunderstood. The Durupinar site, however, presents a different situation. It is easily accessible to researchers and can be examined using modern scientific instruments. Rather than relying solely on visual impressions, investigators are able to collect measurable data and compare it against geological expectations. The central question is no longer whether the formation exists, but what its internal characteristics actually reveal. If the conventional geological explanation is ultimately correct, then the formation represents an extraordinary example of nature creating a remarkably ship-like landscape. Its outline resembles an ancient vessel. Its reported dimensions closely parallel those described in biblical accounts. It lies within a region associated with ancient flood traditions, and researchers have reported unusual underground features together with elevated levels of organic material. Nature is capable of producing surprising formations, and the human brain is naturally inclined to recognize familiar shapes, even where none were intentionally created. On the other hand, if future investigations demonstrate that the underground cavities are genuine structural features, that the soil composition reflects the remains of ancient organic material, and that the dimensional similarities are more than coincidence, the archaeological significance would be considerable. Even then, such a discovery would not automatically confirm every detail of the biblical flood story. Ancient historical traditions are often shaped by centuries of storytelling, cultural memory, and symbolic interpretation. Many scholars believe that flood accounts preserved across the ancient Near East may have originated from powerful regional disasters rather than a single worldwide event. However, evidence of a preserved ancient vessel would suggest that these traditions were inspired by a real historical object. It would indicate that an unusually large ship may once have been constructed in the ancient Near East and survived long enough to become the foundation of stories passed down through generations instead of existing solely as legend. For that reason, the investigation continues to attract worldwide attention. Since Ilhan Durupinar first photographed the formation from the air in 1948, the site has remained at the center of scientific debate. Decades have brought competing theories, disputed claims, and repeated expeditions, yet no final conclusion has satisfied everyone. Today, researchers possess technologies that earlier generations could only imagine. Advanced scanning systems have already mapped portions of the formation beneath the surface. Laboratory testing is underway, and specialists continue to interpret the growing collection of evidence. Some of the preliminary observations differ from what many geologists originally expected, making further study increasingly important. Whether the Durupinar Formation ultimately proves to be an unusual natural landform, or something far more significant, remains an open question. Scientists involved in the project continue to investigate. Turkish authorities continue to authorize the research, and scholars around the world are closely following every new development. Regardless of competing opinions, one fact remains unchanged. A 538-foot-long, boat-shaped formation still rests high in the mountains of eastern Turkey on the slopes of the extinct Mount Ararat volcano. Its existence is undeniable, only its true origin remains uncertain. The field surveys have largely been completed, but the scientific analysis is still in progress. After decades of speculation, researchers may finally be approaching an answer to the mystery hidden beneath the Durupinar Formation. Whether the final conclusions support traditional beliefs, reinforce conventional geology, or reveal an entirely unexpected explanation, the evidence itself will ultimately decide. For now, the data continues to grow, the questions remain open, and deep within the highlands once associated with the ancient land of Ararat, one of archaeology's most fascinating mysteries is still waiting to be solved.